I think this is the most important hour I have ever been a part of in broadcast. I've done this for 45 years. This is the most important person and hour you can spend. Today's guest has a gift for locating power and hunting it in its darkest corners. She realized that Epstein was not an anomaly. She is somebody who has written 2 volumes on just him, but you will see it is connected to entire networks of power and influence, a web of elites who operate under the principle that rules are for other people. Her 2-volume book, One Nation Under Blackmail, the sordid union between intelligence and crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein, is out. Keep your eye on this one. She is sharp. She is a massive threat to powerful people. If people will listen and do their own homework and just explore what she's saying, the game is up. She's the kind of writer who reminds the elites that they're not actually above rules and we're not all a bunch of rubes. Please welcome Whitney Webb. We are on the verge of this. This is happening. It could
faster
happen
than ever. Yeah.
Yeah. It could happen 20, 25, 30, 35. It's here now.
Yeah.
Explain what transhumanism is and why it is so dangerous.
Yeah, so I'll just probably start with the history of it. So there was a man named Julian Huxley. He's the brother of the famous author Aldous Huxley. He was president of the British Eugenics Society. The United Nations is created after World War II. He is put in charge of UNESCO. In writing his vision for UNESCO, Julian Huxley says about eugenics, we need to make the unthinkable thinkable again. 10 years later, he coins the term transhumanism in a book called...
Did he read his brother's work?
I'm sure, actually, that Aldous Huxley's work was influenced by the type of social milieu he inhabited, which would include his brother. And, sort of those intellectual circles where both of them grew up, right? Okay. This is the British aristocracy, and really a lot of the idea of eugenics going back to Francis Galton and, Darwinism and all of that, it seems to sort of emanate from there.
Fabian socialists and all of that.
Yes. So in a book in 1957, I believe, called New Bottles for New Wine, something like that, Julian Huxley coins the terms transhumanism and talks about how the new eugenics is going to be merging man with machine. So this is basically eugenics rebranded, and a lot of people that funded eugenics causes of the past, like the Rockefeller family, are, big proponents of transhumanism today, and it's getting increasingly problematic. I would say, if you look, for example, at the new head of the FDA, who very few people have bothered to look into, Robert Califf, he's a former Google Health executive. Google Health has a joint venture with GlaxoSmithKline called Galvani Bioelectronics. I think the former head of that was Moncef Slaoui, who was in charge of Operation Warp Speed, and their focus is what they call bioelectronic medicine, which is, injectable nanotechnology that can manipulate your central nervous system. What are the implications of that? We have the person that just purchased Twitter, making a brain chip company. He's also a major contractor to the U.S. military. He has a major conflict of interest with Chinese Silicon Valley equivalents like Tencent.
He says, and I love this, he says, that's one of the reasons why I want to get off the planet. He says his work is to find a way to compete against the transhumanistic, folly. You don't believe that at all?
I don't buy it. No. If you look at that company, they had animal trials. Many of the monkeys that was tested and died after the brain chip was put in. If that were my company, I would reformulate everything or shut it down if it was going to kill that many animals. But it's already moved into human trials. I mean,
even though it's killing all the monkeys.
Well, it killed many monkeys. I forget the exact number, but a significant portion.
This is where it gets frightening.
Well, it's tied up with depopulation, right? You have this being sort of the new path of eugenics. And so, I don't think these people ultimately care about, how many people are left, right?
Smart and right.
Well, eugenics is...
you.
I mean, people like to act like eugenics disappeared, and it hasn't. It's just rebranded. And if you look at the history, it's very clear, and it's very disconcerting.
That's why everything you're seeing that is coming out of policy all over the world, all of the World Economic Forum seems so
look
Malthusian.
At Canada, the medically assisted death originally it was going to be for terminally ill people. Now people are pitching it to homeless people in Canada, saying you're too poor to live. Do you want to kill yourself?
How do we not remember what happened last time?
Well, I think some of these people, you look at the Rockefellers, they funded what happened last time. Yeah. A lot of that money that was used to set up the Nazi eugenics program came from the Rockefeller Foundation, and that's a matter of record. They've tried to go back and say, oh, we're sorry, but they're funding a lot of this stuff now.
Giant corporations are in bed with all of this stuff. And someday they'll be hiding it and go, no, we didn't do anything with that. But I don't know if...
I don't think they even have to now. I mean, if it really gets to the transhumanist point and they can just manipulate, this is an attempt to manipulate consciousness.
Yes.
Really. So, and memory and all of that. I mean, they don't have to even bother with it anymore once it gets to that point.
I talked to Ray Kurzweil once and I said, you put the nanotechnology, just help me out here, Ray. I'm a science fiction writer. You put the nanotechnology into me and you control it. Not me. You control it. And I start speaking out about things that you and the powerful don't like. Why don't you just turn me off? Why don't you just, you know what? And all that nanotechnology, and I just die.
Sure.
And his response was, because we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, let's trust us. How has that gone for the, past 100 years or so? Right. And if organized crime are the people in charge, are you going to trust them? I mean, they want us to trust in them. If you look at the World Economic Forum or even the Biden administration and a lot of their policy documents, one of their main focuses are rebuilding trust with the public. And it's not working.
Yeah, it's not.
But they may be looking at drastic interventions to make it work. And I think, if we're transhumanism to be shoehorned through, that could happen. And if you're seeing this... there's sort of these mergers, because there's many of them, of Silicon Valley companies and big pharma. They're framing it as healthcare, but it's eugenics being framed as healthcare. And it's really...
terrifying.
I mean, it's terrifying. It's crazy. There's a lot of words for it, but, ultimately it has to be stopped. And unfortunately, COVID has set this precedent where it can be mandatory. Or where you can lose your livelihood, where you can, not be able to travel. You can basically be placed under house arrest unless you agree to it.
If you don't, in the grand scheme of where we've all been upgraded, we're all part of the internet.
Upgraded.
Yeah, I know.
I don't think that's the intention. That's how they're selling it to people. If you look at this, for example, the British Eugenics Society, where a lot of this came from, you look at someone like H.G. Wells, best known as a science fiction writer, but also a avowed eugenicist. He predicted that in 100 to 200 years, there would be two human races. There would be the upgraded, augmented elite who were intellectual and attractive and, were the ones that did everything. And then a dwarf-like, troll-like, squat underclass that eats bugs. They're selling this as one way. It's all going to be a utopian thing if we all upgrade. I mean, that's how it's being framed, right? But if you look at how these people think, they don't want that. They're looking at feudalism and how do you create a class of slaves that cannot even cognitively rebel ever again.
These teachers' unions said, we care about, minorities and everything else. They did more damage to a whole generation of minorities more than they did white kids. But they put kids in general into the gears of the machine. I
live in South America. The lockdowns there were brutal. Everyone was under house arrest, basically. You were only allowed out of your house twice a week with papers that you had to show to police. Each paper was good for roughly 3 hours. And my daughter goes to daycare. She's 4, and she was thankfully, shielded from a lot of this and was able to have interaction and stuff. But a lot of kids weren't. And a lot of kids her age and younger are nonverbal. They scream, like, instead of talking. I mean, it's devastating. And the fact that these people, act like it was for the children or for public health when, the evidence increasingly comes out and it wasn't, it was for something else. And I think it's increasingly becoming clear what that something else is and was.
The ESG and World Economic Forum plan is evil. I mean, it seems an overused word, and it's one I swore off about 5 years ago. I said, I don't want to call things evil because it has to be evil is a different level. But when you're talking about controlling and dumbing down and enslaving and destroying, I don't know what other word to use for it. And they've gotten away with saying this is conspiracy theory. Well, they just, I think that's, since the term really entered the American vernacular after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, it's been used to basically claim that if you think powerful people get together to discuss how to advance their power and keep it at the expense of everyone else, that they have any agency, you're crazy. It all has to be a coincidence. They never have any bad intentions. The people that, are the oligarchs that, fund our politicians and have ties with intelligence and have monopolies and, the technology that runs our lives and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, it's, I think at this point you have to be quite naive to think that's actually the case. Somebody like Klaus Schwab.
I think, it's not just Klaus Schwab. I think Klaus Schwab is sort of a man who is there to facilitate. I mean, let's talk about the World Economic Forum for a second and what it is and what it's not. They describe themselves as the premier promoter of public-private partnerships. For lack of a better word, that is fascism. So then you have the family history of Klaus Schwab, that his father ran a Nazi model company and funded the atomic bomb and all of that, and just very complicated stuff there. And you basically have him being in this position where he's promoting, fascism on a global
I mean, he's
a
white kitty cat away from being a James Bond supervillain.
Well, but I think that's, they want everyone to focus on him and think that it's just him and just the World Economic Forum. There's other organizations that are promoting this too. And also a lot of the, the Young Global Leader program, that's not exclusive to the World Economic Forum. There's lots of other institutions with similar agendas, that sort of are related to the World Economic Forum, which seeks, not just public-private partnerships and fascism, but global governance. There's a lot of these organizations seating their people in certain places. Unfortunately, you look at the World Economic Forum, a lot of the banks are very involved. And when you are in bed with the banks and the banks are in bed with you,
you're fine.
It's very hard to go against that in today's world. And, they're making it even harder on the little people in Canada that protested with the trucker protest. They were deplatformed, not from social media, but from the financial system. And I think that's going to become increasingly common. It's already happening to a lot of people that I work with, taken off of PayPal, having trouble with their banks, Venmo. I mean,
Sure.
And I think that's going to, become increasingly commonplace, and that's how they're going to try and force compliance. And, a big part of this, you have the move towards a central bank digital currency and all of that at the same time, which is programmable money. The state decides whether you save or you spend. They decide what you can and can't buy and all this stuff. And all the central banks, even on the, in places like Russia, where Vladimir Putin talks a good game about nationalism and protecting our culture, they're going full steam ahead with that too.
It's the way you control a population.
Yeah. And I think all these governments are really interested right now in domestic control.
So what does America look like at the end? China?
That is the goal of a lot of people at the highest levels of Silicon Valley in our government. I would say, sure.
I have friends who are industrialists, and they would say to me 30 years ago, China's the new model. And I thought, that's a bad model. We don't want that. And they would just flippantly just say, China's the new model. It wasn't until 10 years later that I started going, wait a minute, they mean that sincerely, that how it works there, all of it, is coming here.
Yeah.
That's
been
terrifying.
planned for a long time. We talked about Chinagate earlier. The origins of Silicon Valley are in that whole mix. And a lot of the most powerful people in our military-industrial complex, including like Lockheed Martin, were involved with that and wanted that sensitive technology to go to China. And undermine our national security. There was something going on there then, and I think we're increasingly seeing it now. I wrote an article in 2020 about the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. They basically say that in order to be competitive in artificial intelligence and secure economic and military hegemony for the United States, we have to go beyond China in terms of their implementation of surveillance technology, the use of artificial intelligence, moving away from private car ownership, which they refer to as a legacy system, in-person doctor visits, to the AI-powered alternative. This was in 2019, before COVID. COVID comes along.
2 years before that, I talked to the chairman of the board at General Motors, and he told me by 2030, we won't be making cars as you know them today. We'll be making fleets.
Yeah,
because people
it's
won't
Uber.
be having,
It's Ubers you rent and you can't control where they go,
Correct.
and they're only going to be in the smart cities. You're not going between cities anymore. No more road trips. No more, you decide, I want to go over here today. I want to drive 3 hours to see my family or whoever, my friends. That's over if these people win. And the National Security Commission on AI was run by Eric Schmidt, former head of Google. One of the co-chair was a top guy that works closely with Schmidt that was at the Department of Defense. And it's the intelligence community, the military, and Silicon Valley. And those are the people increasingly running the show. And they think if we don't go beyond China's surveillance system and mega city, smart city model, we will fail. And then you have people like Elon Musk coming in and saying, I want to take over Twitter for free speech. And then he also says, I want to make Twitter into basically like WeChat, which is, basically a surveillance app to use in China. That's for your finances, your social media, pretty much everything is on that app. They even call it the Everything app. And that's his model. And the parent company of that, Tencent, is one of Tesla's shareholders and, most active advisors. So is that data going to stay, that he's going to get from Twitter, the new Twitter, when it becomes a WeChat equivalent? Where's that going to go? I mean, there's a lot. If you look at, the China connection here, it's, when I was before I wrote the book, I didn't realize the extent of the overlap, but it's very concerning. You have people with major conflicts of interest running our national security policy on things like AI that have conflicts of interest with China. And Eric Schmidt just wrote a book with Henry Kissinger, and these guys basically argue in order to avoid a cataclysmic war with China, we have to make good and cooperate with China. And the model for that is basically, the World Economic Forum. I mean, they argue the same thing, global governance and technocracy, following the China model here. And it's very against everything most Americans are accustomed to. But they're, I guess, finding ways to manufacture consent for it, whether the justification's climate change, it's COVID, it's a food and energy crisis that's been manufactured. Whatever will stick, they'll use. But the problem is you're having the people that control Silicon Valley behind this. They control where most people get their information, where most people socialize today. And they're increasingly censoring people from platforms. They're waging basically a war on dissent. That I've written about a few times, and it's getting, increasingly Orwellian to the point where, they'll label you misinformation or, this is disinformation. But, the Biden administration, if their war on domestic terror advances the way they've written it out, you say the wrong thing or you disagree with the state even or the official narrative, you're, inciting violence. You're potentially a domestic violent extremist.
Right.
And that's happened in history before, not necessarily in the United States, but other countries. And, it's pretty clear that once that type of policy gets implemented, things go downhill very quickly.
Do you have hope at all that if the Republicans could win, it at least slows it down? I mean, I think people in the Republican, there's clearly people who go to Washington and actually believe it, and then are turned, or they go to Washington, they're already a dirtbag and they know what they're getting into.
Yeah.
And then there's a few that go and stand and are trying to hold the line.
But they're a minority.
A big minority.
Or they get forced out.
Correct.
If I'm not mistaken, Ron Johnson, right? Was the one that challenged a lot of COVID narratives.
Yes.
And I mean, even mainstream media, NPR, supposed to be objective, says,
Yeah.
oh, he spreads conspiracy theories and his challenger's a rising star. And, I mean, they're very clear about who they favor and who they don't. And if they don't want you to win, they'll gerrymander your district. They'll do some, I mean, there's lots of tools that they can use to prevent you from staying in office, and who knows what we'll see in the midterm elections. But ultimately, those type of people that are willing to stand their ground and actually fight for the American people are very few. It doesn't really matter what party you're talking about. It's very small number when you consider the amount of votes needed to pass certain legislation.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately, the way out of this is for the American people to realize that yes, this is a fight between good and evil, but if you're looking for the good guys, stop looking at people that are put on the TV screens in front of you and start looking at your neighbors.
Yeah.
And
the answer is so clear. Local. Local.
Yes, absolutely. This is really us versus them. It's not left versus right anymore.
Yes.
We are so far beyond that.
Yeah.
Really.
And it's amazing and very heartening how many people that I know and I interview that we would have been against each other 15 years ago. We would say, "Oh, you're," and now it's like, no, forget all of that.
Yeah.
And it's heartening that people are waking and starting to come together. Question is, do we make it fast enough? I've been saying for a while, this is going to be a photo finish. I don't know which one's going to.
I don't think anyone really does, and I think it comes down to how much responsibility people are willing to take for their own lives, and how far communities are willing to go to ensure that they're self-reliant in the face of what we're facing.
What does that mean to you?
Well, if the banks are deplatforming people, you can't use their financial system. Are you going to go to the CBDC land where eventually you won't be able to spend money without like a microchip in your hand and all of this stuff? There's obvious red lines people can't cross. How are you going to feed your family? How are you going to keep your house heated in winter? Basic needs. I think we should probably be taking some lessons from the Amish, to be honest. I think, I think they got a lot of stuff right.
That the Amish, they're going to be fine. They're going to be fine. We have outsourced everything.
Our needs to corporations that want to enslave us. So we have to start producing our own stuff at a local level. It's all about exit and build, and that's what we have to do. And the more people that do that, the better off we will be. The real question is how accustomed are Americans to convenience, and will we be enslaved by that convenience or not? And I think that's the ultimate.
So far, we have been.
A lot of people have been.
Yeah.
I'm personally looking at trying to put as much of my money as I can in things that will keep me and my family self-sufficient, come what may, which in my case included like investing in land. So I'm not renting. I own where I live. I have enough land to produce what my family needs in terms of food, stocking up on things that I can't produce. Things like that. That's where my money is personally going, but I am not in the business of telling people, giving financial advice beyond that. Sure. But, if the goal is to develop parallel systems so we're not dependent on the systems of the people trying to enslave us, whatever you think is a good way to get from point A to point B, that's probably where your money should be going. If Bitcoin's a part of that, if you feel that way, good for you. And if not, good for you too. I think ultimately what we need to do is try and create something so that we can be resilient and not have to, because the system is just so unacceptable. It's really not just it's not just against freedom and all sorts of other values, right? It's against nature. It's against life, really. And so, if you're going to support that, I think people have to realize the consequences that come with that and exactly what it means when you are willing to give yourself over to that kind of system, the implications of that. And I think a lot of people don't really realize that or take the time to think about it. And I think they should.
everyone said these things were crazy. We are now transitioning kids because there's no gender identity anymore. We are sexualizing our youngest kids. Where is that coming from? It's such a force.
If your ultimate goal is total control, you need to have a population that has no national identity, that has no identity, period. That identity can be fluxed and can be moved whenever convenient for the people on top. If people have an identity and know who they are and know where they stand, they're a lot harder to control. And I think if you make all of that fluid at every level, it's a lot easier to exert your will over them because, they don't have their feet firmly on the ground, right? Look at who has taken over our education system. You go back to things like the Rockefeller family or their role in healthcare. There's a lot of oligarch families that have very specific agendas that have really taken over government policy, and it's been like that for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And they're not elected. No one put them in charge. Actually, a lot of people used to hate the Rockefeller family until, they started a major PR campaign to rebrand themselves as philanthropists that a lot of other unpleasant people have since followed. The long-term consequences of that we are seeing today. But anyway, in terms of my background, I was, 21, 22, and just looking around, I'm 33, so I'm a millennial, right? And most people my age just, I could see a lot of this stuff, like we're too dependent on corporations that have a lot of nasty agendas or do bad things. There's a lot of issues, a lot of illegal wars, no accountability at the highest levels of government. If people my age don't start doing something, it's going to get really bad. And most people were like, stop talking about that. I have Netflix and beer, so I don't care. Everything's fine as long as, I'm comfortable, basically. Screw your politics or screw your concerns. And I just,
then wait,
I left the U.S. after that.
How can these same group of people, that generation, claim that no, you have to be an activist. You have to be involved in climate change. And, I'm going to sit down and glue myself to a wall like a moron.
Yeah, well, that's the activism that's put in front of young people today, and they're being told that's what activism is, and that's the activism that's sort of in vogue because it's shown and treated by mainstream media as sticking it to the man.
Right. These
people throwing tomato soup on paintings, but you look at those groups, I think they're called Just Stop Oil. They're funded by the Getty and Rockefeller families. And the Rockefeller family, made their money off of oil, but, they have a long-time interest in eugenics and funding.
Correct.
People that basically helped create this sort of new environmental movement that downplays pollution and plays up carbon dioxide, and that's all we should be worried about. And, it's the biggest, I think the quote from the Club of Rome is the biggest enemy of humanity is man, and furthering, that narrative, not that, it's not the corporations that pollute or even the U.S. military is even by, climate change metrics, the biggest contaminator of, the planet and all of that, it's not about those guys. It's just about the regular people. But really what it's about is controlling how much energy people can use. And if you control how much energy a household can use, you can control their economic activity. You also control how big their family can get. And I think that's ultimately what it's about. It's not about the environment for these people, and a lot of it is, Wall Street driven. You look at the United Nations, a lot of the people they put in charge of climate change policy. You have Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, I believe. He's one of the guys that came in to rescue HSBC when they were caught money laundering for Mexican drug cartels. Not exactly a good guy, and it's very unlikely that he is driven by concern about the environment. And then the other person is Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York and billionaire guy. And so these are the people crafting the solutions. And just like COVID, you don't have time to think about what we're telling you. You just have to accept these solutions, because if you don't, something really, really bad will happen. And it's sort of a similar narrative to what, was played out with COVID and
everything, guns, cars, everything.
Yeah. So, people are it's fear driven to get people to accept policies they otherwise wouldn't accept because they're told this cataclysmic event is just down the line. And trust us, again, is the conclusion of that. So, there's people that agree with the narrative about climate change, and there's people that don't. And I'm not trying to really get in that space when I talk about this stuff. I'm trying to point out that the solutions are coming mostly from Wall Street, and they're things like carbon markets. They're things like debt for climate swaps, which back in the day used to be debt for land swaps, not about climate change, about other stuff. And then you have people like Larry Fink of BlackRock and Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney coming together in something like GFAN saying, why don't we give Wall Street direct control of the IMF and the World Bank for climate change?
Right.
How can anyone on the left that's worried about climate change sign up on that? Why don't they talk about planting trees? Why isn't Bill Gates the largest private landowner in the U.S. now planting trees like crazy if he's so worried about carbon dioxide? He poo-poos the whole idea of planting trees as a way to combat climate change. It's just carbon markets and going to electric vehicles and all of this stuff. But electric vehicles necessitates mass mining, and a lot of that mining is in places that use child labor, or it's going to be so environmentally destructive you totally destroy the developing world, which these people on the left supposedly want to protect. You're going to totally destroy the environment. I live in the south of Chile, in the Andes. It's one of the only areas in Chile that's still forested and really nice, not polluted water, any of that. Most of the mining in Chile is historically in the north, which has become very polluted and has a lack of water, among other things. And now the mines are starting to move south because of this demand for more and more minerals for, electric vehicles and all of that. A lake that used to be used for tourism, there was some mineral, I forget what it is, discovered in the lake shore, and then the water just disappears one season, and now it's ready to be mining right next to a national park. I used to live and work in Peru. They were talking about putting a uranium mine next to Machu Picchu and all types of stuff. I mean, this is the mining stuff is not being talked about, and, electrical vehicles are being marketed as necessary, but it's going to come at a massive, massive cost. And I think that, again, the environmental movement is focused on carbon dioxide. If they were really worried about the environment, they would also educate people on how destructive this type of mining is and what it does to the people who live there and the environment, and including in protected areas. There's a lot of species in this particular area of Chile where I live that are only there, and they've been there for thousands of years, and they'll not exist if a lot of this mining goes forward. But if you ask people like Bill Gates, for example, who has a joint venture with most of the other titans of Silicon Valley called Cobalt Metals, they say all of the world's reserves of lithium, cobalt, and nickel must be completely mined if we even want to get close to the electrical vehicle revolution. So that means digging up the entire Andes, including areas that are national parks right now. And even if they do, with all the reserves that we know that we have, you're not going to be able to reproduce the amount of private cars in use today. It's going to be way less cars. And so they're just going to be, the model's already sort of been out there. They fielded it in the UK recently. You can't drive out of your district and all of that stuff. It's going to be much more controlled, the freedom of movement. Well, it's not really going to be freedom of movement. It's going to be controlled movement.
Last question. Are you optimistic?
So that's a tricky question. Sometimes you're working and writing on this stuff. It's ups and downs.
Yeah,
sometimes you feel inspired. Sometimes you're like, oh my gosh, you
no
just want to
out.
face palm. Yeah. But ultimately there's really no other way to be except to believe totally in a better future. We have to be totally committed to that if we're going to do it and do it quickly. And, I have a lot of hope that Americans, when things get really rough, will come together, at least most of us.
I think so, too.
But, in the environment we're in right now, I think it's incumbent on everyone, no matter how small or big your platform is, to speak up about what is happening. Well, the government wants to define what is true and what is not. I wrote a recent article about that in explaining some of the calls to basically make it such. And it's even if they try and do that and they try and say, this is the state, the state is defining truth, and if you deviate from that, you are inciting violence, and all of that. But the problem is people at a visceral level gravitate toward the truth. So they hear it and they're like, oh, that makes sense. Or they look at the sourcing. Or they investigate for themselves and they realize what is true and what is not. So, the state and Silicon Valley, there's really not that much space between them, to be honest, at this point. They can try and censor and manipulate and whatever, but ultimately people are going to gravitate towards what is true. And there's going to be a point where they're not going to be able to really, the tools they have now will not work. And I think a lot of that is that time will come once people stop trying to use these platforms that they are manipulating and start just going out and talking to people they know. We have to get offline, and we have to do it quickly. Maybe even get back, circulating in print stuff that's printed. I mean, we really have to stop being so dependent on these platforms that they're obviously manipulating. I think everyone knows about it, or they're censoring people from, and they're using it to profile you. Stop giving them your data and start getting in the real world and telling people what's what. I mean, they may call you crazy, but the stakes are too high to not do it. That's how I feel.